According to Walter's notes, he tried repeatedly to contact you about delivering the revised will, but he was told you were unavailable and that someone else in your firm could handle the matter. Walter refused to work with anyone else because my father had specifically requested that the document go directly to you. Brennan was reading Walter's notes with increasing attention, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. Miss Chen, I never received any calls from Walter Hoffman about your father's estate. If he had contacted my office, I would have taken his call immediately. Walter was a respected member of the financial planning community, and I had worked with him on several estate matters over the years. The confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Walter Hoffman had been deliberately prevented from reaching Harold Brennan, not by bureaucratic inefficiency, but by someone who had manipulated the communication to ensure the revised will never reached its intended destination. "Who else in your office knew about my father's estate?" Sarah asked. Brennan consulted his files, checking dates and notes about the probate process. "Very few people, actually. Estate matters are handled with strict confidentiality. My assistant knew about the appointment for the will reading, and our probate clerk would have processed the documentation, but the details would have been restricted to essential personnel only." "Is it possible that someone outside your firm could have accessed information about the estate or interfered with your office communications?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of Sarah's question. "Miss Chen, what you're suggesting would constitute serious professional misconduct and potentially criminal fraud. I want to be very careful about how we proceed." He picked up his phone and called his assistant, asking her to bring the file on Robert Chen's estate and to check the phone logs from the week following Robert's death. When the assistant arrived with the requested materials, Brennan spread them across his desk and began cross-referencing Walter's notes with his office's records. "This is very disturbing," he said after several minutes of investigation. "According to our phone logs, Walter Hoffman never called this office. But according to his notes, he made multiple attempts to reach me. Either Walter was documenting calls he didn't actually make, which seems unlikely given his reputation for accuracy, or someone was intercepting those calls before they reached my office." Sarah felt vindicated, but also deeply angry as the full scope of the deception became clear. "How would someone intercept calls to your office?" "There are several possibilities," Brennan explained grimly. "If someone had access to our phone system or was working with our answering service, they could redirect calls or simply fail to pass along messages. Or if someone at another law firm had a working relationship with my office, they might have been able to pose as a representative and mislead callers about my availability." The mention of another law firm brought Vivian Rhodes immediately to mind. "Mr. Brennan, do you have any professional relationship with Morrison, Keller and Associates?" Brennan nodded slowly. "We collaborate on complex estate matters occasionally. They handle some of the larger estates in the area, and we sometimes refer clients to each other. Why do you ask?" Sarah explained about Vivian Rhodes and her connection to Marcus, including her employment as a paralegal at Morrison, Keller and Associates. As she spoke, Brennan's expression grew increasingly grave. "Miss Chen, if what you're suggesting is true, we're looking at a coordinated effort to defraud you of your inheritance. Someone with knowledge of legal procedures and access to professional networks deliberately prevented your father's revised will from being probated. What can we do about it?" Sarah asked. Brennan leaned back in his chair, clearly considering the legal and ethical implications of the situation. "First, we need to authenticate the revised will you found in your father's papers. If it can be proven genuine, and if we can demonstrate that it was deliberately suppressed, we can petition the court to set aside the original probate and implement your father's true final wishes." "And the people who suppressed it?" "If we can prove deliberate interference with the probate process, they could face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. But we'll need substantial evidence beyond what you've brought me today." Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. The evidence existed to prove that Marcus and Vivian had conspired to steal her inheritance. But gathering that evidence would require careful investigation and probably some degree of confrontation with people who had already proven themselves willing to commit fraud. "What kind of evidence would we need?" she asked. Brennan pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Documentation of the phone call interference, proof that Vivian Rhodes used her professional connections to prevent Walter from reaching me, evidence of the credit card fraud that created the debt you inherited, and, ideally, some admission or acknowledgement from the parties involved. How do we get that kind of evidence? Very carefully, Brennan replied. If Marcus and Vivian realize we're investigating them, they could destroy evidence or coordinate their stories to protect themselves. We need to be strategic about how we approach this. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon working with Brennan to develop a plan for gathering the evidence they needed. The attorney would investigate the phone call interference through official channels, checking with his office's answering service, and contacting Morrison Keller and Associates about any irregular communications regarding the Chen estate. Sarah's role would be more delicate. She would need to confront Marcus about the credit card fraud and attempt to get him to admit his knowledge of the revised will. The conversation would need to be documented, preferably recorded, to provide evidence of his involvement in the fraud. Be very careful, Brennan warned as they concluded their meeting. If Marcus realizes you're on to him, he might take steps to protect himself that could make it harder to prove the fraud. Don't let him know about the revised will until we have more evidence to support our case. That evening, Sarah called Marcus and invited him to dinner at their father's house, explaining that she wanted to discuss some questions about their father's final expenses and the estate settlement. Marcus agreed readily, perhaps eager to maintain the pretense that he was a grieving son concerned about practical matters rather than someone who had systematically defrauded his own family. He arrived the next evening carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly somber expression he had adopted since their father's death. Sarah had spent the day preparing for their conversation, organizing the credit card statements, and practicing how to present her questions in a way that might elicit honest responses. "I've been going through Dad's financial records," she began, after they had settled in the living room with their wine. "There are some charges I don't understand, and I was hoping you might have some insight." Marcus nodded sympathetically. Dad's finances were pretty complicated toward the end.
All those medical expenses and medications, I'm not surprised there are some confusing charges. Sarah pulled out the credit card statements, pointing to the charges from Vivian's art gallery. These are what I'm confused about. Almost $8,000 in art purchases over 6 months, but I haven't found any expensive artwork in the house. Do you know what Dad might have bought? Marcus studied the statements with what appeared to be genuine confusion, but Sarah caught a flicker of something else in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "That is weird," he said finally. "Dad never seemed that interested in collecting art. Maybe he was buying gifts for people? You know how he liked to be generous." "Gifts worth $8,000? Sarah pressed. "That seems like a lot, especially when he was struggling with medical expenses." Marcus shrugged, but his casual demeanor seemed forced. "Dad always had his own way of handling money. You know that better than anyone. You were managing his finances." The subtle accusation stung. Marcus was implying that if there were irregular charges, they were Sarah's responsibility as their father's financial caregiver. "I was managing his checking account and his regular bills," she clarified. "I didn't know about these credit cards until after he died." "Credit cards he didn't tell you about?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like Dad. He was always so meticulous about his finances." Sarah felt her temper rising, but forced herself to remain calm. Marcus was trying to turn the conversation back on her, suggesting that she had been negligent in her oversight of their father's finances. "The cards were hidden in his desk drawer, Marcus. Someone was using them regularly, making charges that I never saw because the statements weren't coming to the house." "Where were the statements going?" Marcus asked, and there was something too casual about the question, as if he already knew the answer. "The credit card company said they were being sent to a P.O. box that Dad had set up," Sarah replied, watching Marcus's face carefully. "Do you know anything about that P.O. box?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Dad mentioned something about wanting to keep some of his financial information private. He was getting confused about bills and paperwork, and I think he was embarrassed about asking for help with everything." It was a plausible explanation, the kind of story that might satisfy someone who wasn't looking deeper into the situation. But Sarah knew from her father's letter that Marcus had been manipulating the confused old man's finances, and she was determined to get him to admit it. Marcus, she said gently, I found something else in Dad's papers, a letter he wrote before he died, explaining some things about his financial arrangements. The change in Marcus's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The casual concern was replaced by sharp attention, and Sarah could see him calculating what she might have discovered. What kind of letter? He asked carefully. He was worried about some of the charges on his credit cards, Sarah said, not yet ready to reveal the full extent of what she knew. He mentioned that someone had been using his cards without permission, and he was planning to report it to the credit card companies. Marcus set down his wineglass with deliberate care. Sarah, Dad was pretty confused toward the end. You know that. Sometimes people with dementia think family members are stealing from them, when really they just can't remember giving permission for things. So you did have permission to use his credit cards? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marcus had walked directly into the trap Sarah had set, admitting his use of their father's credit cards while trying to justify it as legitimate. I helped him with some purchases occasionally, Marcus said slowly. Art supplies for my work, some gifts, practical things. Dad wanted to support my graphic novel project, and sometimes it was easier for him to give me his card than to write checks. $8,000 in art supplies and gifts? Marcus's face was flushing slightly, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composure. I don't know the exact amount, Sarah. I didn't keep track of every little purchase. Dad said it was fine, that he wanted to invest in my future. But you didn't tell me about any of this while I was managing his other expenses and trying to stretch his budget to cover his medical care. Dad asked me not to mention it, Marcus said defensively. He said you were already stressed about money and he didn't want to add to your worries. Sarah felt the conversation slipping away from her as Marcus painted himself as a dutiful son, protecting her from financial stress, rather than someone who had been secretly draining their father's resources. She needed to push harder to get him to reveal the full extent of his deception. Marcus, there's something else, she said, pulling out Walter Hoffman's notes. Walter was supposed to deliver something to Dad's attorney after he died, but he wasn't able to complete that task before his own death. Do you know anything about what Walter was trying to deliver? The blood drained from Marcus's face so quickly that Sarah was reminded of Vivian's reaction when she had mentioned Harold Brennan.
Marcus stared at Walter's notes as if they were written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I don't know what you're talking about, he said finally, but his voice was strained and unconvincing. You visited Janet Hoffman the day after Walter died, Sarah continued relentlessly. She told me you asked about documents Walter might have been holding for Dad. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the darkening street. Sarah, I was trying to help. I knew Walter had been working on some things for Dad, and I thought Janet might need assistance settling his affairs. What kind of things? I don't know, Marcus snapped, turning back to face her. Financial stuff, maybe some insurance paperwork. Dad mentioned that Walter was helping him organize his estate planning. Sarah could see that Marcus was becoming agitated, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the pressure of her questions. She decided to take the biggest risk of the evening. Marcus, I know about the revised will. The words hit him like a physical blow. Marcus sank back into his chair, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. What revised will? He asked weakly. The one Dad wrote 6 weeks before he died, when he realized what you'd been doing with his credit cards and his finances. The one that would have given me half of his liquid assets instead of leaving me with nothing but debt. Marcus buried his face in his hands, and Sarah could see his shoulders shaking. When he looked up, his eyes were red with tears that might have been genuine grief or might have been fear of being caught. Sarah, you don't understand, he said desperately. Dad was confused. He was angry about things that weren't real, paranoid about people taking advantage of him. That revised will wasn't his true intention. It was written during one of his confused episodes. Dad to letter explains exactly why he wrote the revised will, Sarah countered. He knew you were using Vivian's legal connections to manipulate his estate planning, and he was trying to protect me from being cheated out of my inheritance. Marcus stared at her in shock. How do you know about Vivian? The admission slipped out before he could stop himself, confirming Sarah's suspicions about Vivian's involvement in the fraud. Marcus realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to take back his words. Vivian helped you suppress Dad's revised will, didn't she? Sarah pressed. She used her connections at Morrison, Keller and Associates to prevent Walter from delivering it to Harold Brennan. Marcus was shaking his head frantically. No, Sarah, you've got it all wrong. Vivian was just trying to help me understand Dad's estate planning. She never interfered with anything. Then why didn't Walter's calls ever reach Brennan? Why was Walter told that Brennan was unavailable when Brennan says he never received any messages? The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus seemed to realize that his denials were no longer believable. He slumped in his chair, looking defeated and exhausted. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. At first, I was just trying to get Dad to support my art project. He was so proud of my work, and he wanted to invest in my future. But then his dementia got worse, and he started getting suspicious and paranoid. So you decided to steal from him? I wasn't stealing, Marcus protested. I was protecting my inheritance from his confused decisions. The original will reflected his true intentions, before the dementia made him paranoid and resentful. Sarah felt sick listening to Marcus justify his theft as protection of his inheritance. Dad wasn't paranoid, Marcus. He was lucid enough to realize that you were taking advantage of his condition and that I deserved compensation for sacrificing my life to take care of him. You didn't sacrifice anything, Marcus said bitterly. You got to be the perfect daughter, the responsible one who always did the right thing. Dad loved you more than he ever loved me. The accusation was so far from reality that Sarah laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet room. Dad left you $350,000 and left me $47,000 in debt. If that's what love looks like in our family, I'd rather be unloved. Marcus was crying openly now, his carefully constructed justifications crumbling under the weight of what he had done. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted to hurt you. I just thought Dad's first will was fairer, and when he changed it because of his confusion, I thought I was protecting what he really wanted. What about the credit card debt? Was protecting your inheritance worth saddling me with bills you created? I was going to pay those back, Marcus said desperately. Once I got my inheritance, I was planning to clear all of Dad's debts and help you get back on your feet. By giving me charity from money that should have been mine anyway? Marcus had no answer for that. He sat in silence, tears streaming down his face, while Sarah processed the magnitude of his betrayal. Her brother hadn't just stolen money, he had systematically manipulated their vulnerable father and then conspired to suppress his final attempt at fairness. What happens now?
Marcus asked finally. Sarah looked at him, this man who shared her DNA but seemed like a stranger after everything she had learned. Now we're going to fix this. You're going to help me prove that Dad's revised will was suppressed, and we're going to implement his true final wishes. And if I don't? Then Harold Brennan will file criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy, and you'll face prosecution for stealing from a vulnerable adult and interfering with the probate process. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to understand that he had run out of options. What do you need me to do? First, you're going to write down everything you did, including how Vivian helped you suppress the revised will. Then, you're going to contact the credit card companies and admit that you made unauthorized charges on Dad's accounts. Finally, you're going to cooperate with Harold Brennan's investigation and help us gather evidence against Vivian. What about my inheritance? Sarah felt no sympathy for his concern about money he had essentially stolen. Dad's revised will split his assets equally between us after paying his legitimate debts. You'll still receive a substantial inheritance, just not the full amount you were counting on.
Marcus seemed to deflate with relief, as if he had expected to lose everything. And you won't press criminal charges? That depends on how cooperative you are and whether we can recover everything that was stolen. They spent the next 2 hours going through Marcus's confession in detail, with Sarah taking notes and asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and Vivian's specific role in the conspiracy. By the end of the evening, she had a comprehensive record of how Marcus and Vivian had manipulated their father's finances and suppressed his revised will. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with an expression of genuine remorse. "I really am sorry, Sarah. I know I messed up everything, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did to you." "You're right," Sarah replied. "Sorry doesn't fix it, but helping me prove what happened and making sure it never happens to anyone else might be a start." After Marcus left, Sarah sat alone in her father's house, surrounded by the evidence of her brother's betrayal and her own determination to seek justice. The conversation had been emotionally devastating, but it had also been productive. Marcus's confession provided the missing pieces of the puzzle, confirming how he and Vivian had conspired to steal her inheritance. Tomorrow, she would meet with Harold Brennan again and present the evidence that would finally implement her father's true final wishes. The legal battle would be complex and emotionally difficult, but Sarah finally had the ammunition she needed to fight back against the people who had underestimated her capacity for persistence and strategic thinking. Her father had been right in his letter. She was stronger than Marcus and more honest than he would ever be. Those qualities, combined with her analytical mind and her determination to seek justice, would be enough to reclaim what was rightfully hers and ensure that her father's true legacy was preserved. Harold Brennan's office felt different the second time Sarah entered it. Armed with Marcus's written confession, documented evidence of credit card fraud, and proof of Vivian Rhodes's professional misconduct, she no longer felt like a grieving daughter seeking answers. She felt like someone prepared to fight for justice. Brennan reviewed the materials with the focused intensity of an attorney who recognized the gravity of what he was examining. Marcus's confession detailed every aspect of the conspiracy, from his unauthorized use of their father's credit cards to Vivian's manipulation of communication channels to prevent Walter Hoffman from delivering the revised will. "This is extraordinary," Brennan said, setting down the confession. "In 30 years of estate law, I've never seen such a systematic effort to defraud a beneficiary. The coordination between Marcus and Ms. Rhodes shows clear intent to commit fraud." Sarah felt vindicated, but also emotionally drained from the process of uncovering her family's betrayal. "What's our next step?" "We file a petition with the probate court to set aside the original will and implement your father's true final testament. With this evidence, I'm confident the court will order a complete re-examination of the estate." Brennan explained that the legal process would involve several phases. First, they would need to authenticate her father's revised will through handwriting analysis and witness testimony. Then, they would present evidence of the conspiracy to suppress that will, including Marcus's confession and documentation of Vivian's interference with Walter's attempts to contact Brennan. "What about criminal charges?" Sarah asked. "That will be up to the district attorney's office," Brennan replied. "Fraud involving vulnerable adults is taken very seriously in Oregon. The evidence you've gathered could support charges of elder abuse, conspiracy, and theft." The legal machinery moved faster than Sarah had expected. Within a week, Brennan had filed the petition to set aside the original probate, and the court had ordered a temporary freeze on Marcus's inheritance pending investigation. Vivian Rhodes was served with a subpoena requiring her to appear for questioning about her role in suppressing the revised will. Sarah's first glimpse of how seriously the authorities were taking the case came when Detective Maria Santos from the Portland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit contacted her. Santos was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in cases involving fraud against elderly victims. "Miss Chen," Santos said during their first meeting, "your brother's confession provides a roadmap for prosecution, but we need to corroborate his claims with independent evidence. I understand you've been documenting the financial irregularities." Sarah provided Santos with copies of all the credit card statements, bank records, and documentation she had gathered. The detective's investigation would focus on proving that Marcus had systematically exploited their father's diminished capacity, and that Vivian had used her professional position to facilitate the fraud. What we're looking for, Santos explained, is a pattern of exploitation that goes beyond simple family financial disputes. If we can prove deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable adult, combined with conspiracy to interfere with legal proceedings, we have grounds for serious criminal charges. The investigation revealed layers of deception that even Sarah hadn't fully understood. Bank records showed that Marcus had been accessing their father's accounts using power of attorney documents that had been signed during periods when Robert Chen's cognitive function was severely compromised. Vivian Rhodes had provided legal guidance on how to structure these transactions to avoid triggering banking alerts that might have exposed the theft. More damaging was evidence that Vivian had indeed used her connections at Morrison Keller and Associates to monitor and redirect Walter Hoffman's attempts to contact Harold Brennan. Phone records showed that calls from Walter's number had been routed to Vivian's extension at the firm, where she had posed as Brennan's assistant and told Walter that the attorney was unavailable. It's a sophisticated scheme, Detective Santos told Sarah during one of their meetings.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rhodes used her legal training to identify vulnerabilities in the probate process and exploited them to steal your inheritance. This isn't amateur hour. The court hearing to determine the validity of Robert Chen's revised will took place on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Sarah arrived early and was surprised to see Vivian Rhodes in the hallway outside the courtroom, looking pale and anxious as she spoke with her attorney. Marcus was already inside, sitting with his own lawyer at a table across from where Sarah would be seated with Harold Brennan. He looked thinner than when she had confronted him at their father's house, and he avoided making eye contact when she entered the courtroom. Judge Patricia Morales presided over the hearing with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had dealt with countless family disputes over money. She listened carefully as Brennan presented evidence that Robert Chen's revised will represented his true final intentions, and that the original will had been probated only because of deliberate interference with the legal process. The handwriting analysis confirmed that the revised will was genuine, written in Robert Chen's hand during a period when medical records showed he was experiencing improved cognitive function. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the neurologist who had treated Robert during his final months, testified that patients with dementia often experience periods of clarity that allow them to make rational decisions about their affairs. Mr. Chen was certainly capable of executing a valid will 6 weeks before his death, Dr. Harper testified. His medical records from that period show improved cognitive function and clear awareness of his family situation. Marcus's attorney attempted to argue that the revised will represented a temporary aberration caused by paranoid delusions, but Marcus's own confession undermined this defense. In his written statement, Marcus had admitted that his father's concerns about financial exploitation were accurate, not delusional. Vivian Rhodes's testimony was the most dramatic moment of the hearing. Under cross-examination by the prosecutor who had been assigned to the criminal case, she broke down and admitted her role in preventing Walter Hoffman from delivering the revised will. "I knew it was wrong," she said through tears, "but Marcus was so desperate, and I thought the original will was probably what Mr. Chen really wanted anyway. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Her admission sealed the case. Judge Morales ruled that Robert Chen's revised will was valid and that the original probate had been obtained through fraud. She ordered the estate to be redistributed according to the revised will's terms, giving Sarah access to half of her father's liquid assets while requiring Marcus to repay the unauthorized credit card charges. The financial impact was transformative for Sarah. Instead of inheriting debt, she received $175,000 in cash and investments, along with the family home free and clear of medical obligations. The money allowed her to pay off her own debts, rebuild her career, and establish the financial security that her father had intended for her to have. Marcus's situation was more complicated. The revised will still left him with a substantial inheritance, but he also faced restitution requirements and potential criminal prosecution. 3 weeks after the court hearing, he was charged with elder abuse and theft, charges that could result in significant jail time if he was convicted. "I keep thinking about Dad," Marcus said during one of their few conversations after the hearing. "He must have been so disappointed in me toward the end." Sarah felt no satisfaction in her brother's obvious anguish. The victory in court had restored her financial security, but it couldn't repair the damage to their family relationships or bring back the years of sacrifice she had made while Marcus was stealing from their father. "Dad loved you," she told Marcus honestly. "Even when he was writing that letter explaining what you'd done, he talked about hoping you would find your way to being a better person." "Do you think he would have forgiven me?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think he would have wanted you to make things right and learn from your mistakes. Whether that constitutes forgiveness is between you and him." Vivian Rhodes pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with the prosecution of other cases involving vulnerable adults. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to Sarah for the legal costs of recovering her inheritance. Her cooperation led to the discovery of 2 other cases where she had used her legal connections to help family members exploit elderly relatives' estates. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that had gone undetected because Vivian was skilled at identifying families where financial abuse was likely to go unnoticed. "People like Miss Rhodes prey on family dysfunction," Detective Santos explained to Sarah. "She targeted situations where there was already favoritism or conflict, making it easier to manipulate the legal process without raising suspicion." Marcus ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation and agreement to pay full restitution. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation and community service, avoiding jail time largely because of his confession and willingness to help recover other victims' stolen assets. The legal resolution provided Sarah with justice and financial security, but the emotional aftermath was more complex. She had won the battle to reclaim her inheritance, but the cost had been the complete destruction of her relationship with Marcus and the knowledge that her final years with their father had been shadowed by exploitation she hadn't recognized. Sarah decided to use part of her inheritance to establish a foundation focused on protecting elderly adults from financial abuse. Working with Detective Santos and other advocates, she developed educational programs to help families recognize signs of exploitation and legal resources to assist victims in recovering stolen assets. "Your father would be proud," Harold Brennan told her when she consulted him about the foundation's legal structure. "He wanted to protect vulnerable people, and you're extending that protection to other families who might face what you went through." The Foundation's first major initiative was lobbying for stronger oversight of legal professionals who work with elderly clients. Sarah's experience with Vivian Rhodes had revealed gaps in professional accountability that allowed unethical paralegals and attorneys to exploit vulnerable clients with minimal risk of detection. 6 months after the court hearing, Sarah received an unexpected letter from Marcus. He was working as a caregiver in an assisted living facility, a job he had taken as part of his community service requirements. The work had given him perspective on the vulnerability of elderly adults and the trust families place in caregivers. "I understand now what I put you through," he wrote. "Not just the money, but the betrayal of trust and the burden of caring for Dad while I was making everything harder. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone who deserves it." Sarah read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. Marcus's acknowledgement of his wrongs felt genuine, but years of manipulation had taught her to be cautious about his motivations. She eventually wrote back with a brief note expressing hope that his work with elderly residents would help him understand the impact of his actions. Their relationship remained distant but civil. Marcus continued his work at the assisted living facility and eventually completed a certification program to become a licensed caregiver. His graphic novel project was never completed, abandoned along with his illusions about easy success and unearned privilege. The most unexpected development came a year after the legal resolution, when Sarah encountered Janet Hoffman at a coffee shop near her downtown office. Walter's widow looked healthier than when Sarah had first visited her, and she greeted Sarah with genuine warmth. "I've been following the news about your case," Janet said as they shared a table by the window. "Walter would have been so proud that you fought for what was right."
He always said your father raised remarkable children, though I suppose he was only half right about that. Janet's gentle humor about Marcus's fall from grace made Sarah smile for the first time in months. "Walter did his best to honor his promise to my father. If he hadn't documented those phone calls, we never would have been able to prove what happened." "He was always meticulous about record keeping," Janet agreed. Sometimes I thought it was excessive, but in this case, it made all the difference. They talked for an hour about their respective healing processes and the challenges of rebuilding life after profound loss and betrayal. Janet had decided to sell her house and move to a retirement community where she could be closer to other people dealing with similar transitions. "I've learned that holding on to anger doesn't honor Walter's memory," Janet said as they prepared to part ways. "But fighting for justice when someone has been wronged, that's different. That's what Walter would have wanted, and it's what your father would have wanted too." Sarah's career rebounded as word spread about her successful legal battle and her advocacy work for elder abuse victims. Several law firms approached her about consulting on cases involving financial exploitation, and she eventually established her own practice specializing in estate fraud and family financial disputes. The work was emotionally demanding but professionally fulfilling. Sarah discovered that her experience with Marcus and Vivian had given her insights into the psychology of financial abuse that made her effective at identifying and proving exploitation in other families. "You have credibility with clients that other attorneys lack," one colleague observed. "When you tell someone that their family member has been stealing from them, they believe you because they know you've been through it yourself." 2 years after her father's death, Sarah stood in the renovated kitchen of his house, now fully hers without the burden of debt that Marcus and Vivian had tried to impose on her. She had considered selling the property and starting fresh somewhere else, but ultimately decided that honoring her father's memory meant preserving the home where he had raised his children and built his life. The house had been transformed from a place of painful memories into a comfortable base for her new life and work. She had converted her father's study into an office where she met with clients and worked on cases involving elder abuse. The dining room where she had confronted Marcus with evidence of his fraud had been redecorated, but she kept her father's chair at the head of the table as a reminder of his presence. Sarah often worked late into the evening, and during those quiet hours, she sometimes imagined conversations with her father about the choices she had made and the life she was building. She pictured him approving of her work to protect other families from the exploitation their own family had endured. "You were right about being stronger than Marcus," she would say aloud sometimes, addressing the empty chair. "And you were right that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting less than you deserve." The foundation Sarah had established grew beyond her initial vision, eventually partnering with law enforcement agencies across Oregon to train officers in recognizing financial abuse and with legal aid organizations to provide free representation for exploitation victims. Her father's name was attached to the foundation's main program, ensuring that Robert Chen's legacy was associated with protection of vulnerable adults rather than the manipulation he had suffered. Marcus remained in Portland, continuing his work in elder care and slowly rebuilding his life within the constraints of his criminal record and damaged reputation. He sent Sarah updates occasionally, describing his work with dementia patients and the insights he had gained about the disease that had affected their father. "I understand now why Dad was so scared and confused," he wrote in one letter. "The residents here go through the same thing, periods of clarity where they know something's wrong, followed by confusion where they can't protect themselves. I see how easy it would be to take advantage of them, and I'm ashamed that I did that to Dad." Sarah appreciated Marcus's growing understanding of their father's experience, but she remained cautious about fully trusting his transformation. The betrayal had been too systematic and the damage too severe for her to quickly embrace the possibility of reconciliation. On the 3rd anniversary of their father's death, Sarah visited his grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone bore his name and dates, along with an inscription she had chosen: "Beloved father who protected those who needed it most." The words reflected not just his work in life, but his final attempt to protect Sarah from exploitation through his revised will. She placed fresh flowers on the grave and spoke quietly about the foundation's work, the cases she had won for other exploitation victims, and the life she had rebuilt from the wreckage of Marcus's betrayal. The conversation felt natural, as if her father was listening and approving of the choices she had made. "I kept the promise I made in your letter," she said, referring to his final words about trusting in her strength. "I didn't let them convince me to accept less than I deserved."
As Sarah drove home from the cemetery, she reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that devastating morning in Harold Brennan's office when she first learned about her supposed inheritance of debt and responsibility. The woman who had walked out of that meeting feeling broken and betrayed was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power and refused to be underestimated. The money she had recovered was important, but not as important as the knowledge that she could fight for herself and win. Her father's revised will had given her financial security, but her own determination had given her something more valuable: the confidence to demand justice and the skills to help others do the same. Sarah Chen had inherited far more than money from her father's estate. She had inherited his commitment to protecting vulnerable people and his belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The inheritance that Marcus and Vivian had tried to steal from her ultimately made her stronger and more purposeful than she had ever been before. The kitchen table where Marcus had confronted his crimes was gone, replaced by a breakfast bar where Sarah now worked on her laptop each morning before heading to her office. The physical symbol of her humiliation had been erased, but the memory of that confrontation remained as a reminder of what she was capable of when pushed too far. Sometimes clients would ask Sarah how she had found the strength to fight such a complex legal battle while dealing with grief and family betrayal. Her answer was always the same. Strength wasn't something she had found, but something she had discovered she already possessed. "I spent years being underestimated by people who thought quiet compliance meant weakness," she would tell them. When they finally pushed too hard, they learned the difference between being patient and being powerless. The story of Sarah's fight to reclaim her inheritance became a cautionary tale in legal circles about the importance of protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. But for Sarah herself, it was simply the beginning of a new chapter, in which she used her experience to ensure that other families wouldn't suffer the same betrayal. Her father's true legacy wasn't the money he'd left behind, but the example he had set about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Sarah had honored that legacy by refusing to accept injustice and by dedicating her life to protecting others who faced similar exploitation. The woman who had once been seated at the kitchen table while more favored family members enjoyed their celebration had become someone who sets the terms of engagement and demanded the respect she deserved. It was, she often thought, exactly what her father would have wanted for her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
When Sarah Chen walked out of the lawyer's office clutching a stack of bills that totaled more than her annual salary, she had no idea that 3 weeks later she would be holding a document that would expose the most calculated betrayal in her family's history. The will reading had left her brother Marcus with their father's entire $200,000 life insurance payout and investment portfolio, while she inherited nothing but $47,000 in medical debt and the responsibility for their father's final expenses. What she discovered hidden in their father's bedroom would change everything and reveal just how far some people will go to steal what doesn't belong to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had always known she wasn't the favorite child, but she never imagined the depths of her family's deception until that gray October morning when attorney Harold Brennan cleared his throat and began reading their father's last will and testament. The small conference room in downtown Portland felt suffocating as Sarah sat across from her brother Marcus, watching his carefully practiced expression of grief mask what she was beginning to suspect was barely contained excitement. The dynamics in the Chen family had been established early and never wavered. Marcus, 3 years older and blessed with their father's easy charm and quick wit, had sailed through life on a combination of natural charisma and carefully cultivated helplessness. At 35, he worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer, moving from one creative project to another whenever the mood struck him, always with some grand vision that never quite materialized into sustainable income. His lifestyle was funded by a rotating cast of romantic partners and periodic bailouts from their father Robert, who viewed Marcus's artistic temperament as something to be nurtured rather than questioned. Sarah, at 32, had taken a decidedly different path. After graduating summa cum laude with a degree in accounting from Portland State University, she had landed a promising position with a mid-sized firm downtown. Her meticulous nature and analytical mind had quickly earned her recognition, and she was on track for a senior position when their father's health began to decline 3 years earlier. Unlike Marcus, who visited sporadically and always seemed to have urgent commitments elsewhere when practical help was needed, Sarah had restructured her entire life around their father's care. The first sign of Robert Chen's cognitive decline had been subtle: missed appointments, repeated questions, occasional confusion about dates. Sarah noticed these changes during her weekly dinners with her father, but when she mentioned her concerns to Marcus, he dismissed them as normal aging. Their father was only 68, still sharp enough to manage his finances and maintain his small ranch-style home in the Hawthorne district. But Sarah could see the gradual erosion of the man who had raised them alone after their mother's death when Sarah was 12. As Robert's condition worsened, diagnosed eventually as early-onset dementia with aggressive progression, Sarah found herself becoming his primary caregiver by default. She reduced her work hours from full-time to part-time, then eventually to consulting work that could be done remotely, allowing her to monitor their father's medications, drive him to medical appointments, and ensure he didn't wander off during his increasingly frequent episodes of confusion. Marcus, meanwhile, had been going through what he described as a particularly intense creative period. He was developing a graphic novel that he insisted would revolutionize the medium, a project that required complete mental focus and couldn't be interrupted by the mundane responsibilities of elder care. Their father supported this endeavor enthusiastically, often telling Sarah that artistic vision couldn't be constrained by conventional schedules, and that she, being naturally organized and responsible, was better suited to handle the practical matters anyway. The financial strain of caring for their father while maintaining only sporadic income had pushed Sarah to the brink of her savings. She had moved into the small guest room of Robert's house, ostensibly to keep him company, but actually because she could no longer afford both her apartment rent and the increasing costs of her father's care. Physical therapy sessions, specialized medications not covered by Medicare, safety modifications to the house, and the services of a part-time aide when Sarah absolutely had to work all added up to expenses that seemed to multiply weekly. Throughout this period, Marcus continued to receive what their father called investment funds for his artistic projects. Sarah learned about these transfers accidentally when she was helping her father organize his paperwork and noticed regular withdrawals of $2,000 to $3,000 monthly made out to Marcus Chen. When she asked their father about them, he explained that Marcus needed financial support to complete his graphic novel, and that once the project was finished and sold, Marcus would of course pay everything back with interest. Sarah had bitten her tongue, knowing that confronting her father about Marcus's track record of unfinished projects and unrepaid loans would only upset him and potentially worsen his cognitive symptoms. She also knew that Marcus had never repaid a loan in his adult life, viewing family financial assistance as gifts rather than debts. But she said nothing, continuing to stretch her own resources thinner while watching thousands of dollars flow to her brother's latest creative venture. The inequality became more pronounced as their father's condition deteriorated. During family dinners, Robert would beam with pride as Marcus described his latest artistic breakthrough or shared news of a potential publisher's interest. Sarah's updates about their father's medical appointments, insurance complications, or necessary home modifications were received with polite attention before the conversation inevitably shifted back to Marcus's projects. She began to feel like a servant reporting on household maintenance while the true heir discussed matters of real importance. The breaking point came during what would be their last Christmas together. Robert's dementia had progressed to the point where he required near constant supervision, and Sarah had been awake for 36 hours straight dealing with a particularly difficult episode that had resulted in a midnight emergency room visit. She was exhausted, stressed, and running on nothing but coffee and determination when Marcus arrived at their father's house on Christmas morning. He swept in like a visiting dignitary, bearing expensive gifts and regaling their father with stories of his latest creative breakthroughs. Marcus had recently begun collaborating with a local gallery owner named Vivian Rhodes, a connection that had him convinced his graphic novel would soon be adapted into a major motion picture. Their father listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking Sarah to bring them coffee or locate documents Marcus wanted to show him from his portfolio. During a quiet moment while their father napped, Sarah attempted to discuss the practical realities of his declining condition with Marcus.
She explained that the current care arrangement was unsustainable, that they needed to discuss assisted living options or, at minimum, hire additional help. Marcus listened with the polite expression he reserved for conversations about topics that didn't interest him. "You're doing such a great job with all this, Sarah," he said when she finished outlining the options. "Dad's lucky to have someone so naturally organized taking care of everything. I wish I could help more, but you know how it is with creative work. I can't just switch off the inspiration when family stuff comes up." The casual dismissal of 3 years of sacrifice as family styles hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at her brother, this charming, perpetually irresponsible man who had somehow convinced their father that his artistic pursuits were more valuable than her actual caregiving, and felt something fundamental shift in how she viewed their family dynamic. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I've given up my career to take care of Dad. I'm broke, exhausted, and I need help, real help, not just appreciation for being naturally organized." Marcus sighed with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Look, I get that it's hard, but this is temporary. Once my graphic novel gets picked up, I'll be able to contribute financially, maybe even hire a professional caregiver so you can get your life back." "And when exactly will that be?" Sarah asked, hearing an edge in her voice that surprised her. "These things take time," Marcus replied vaguely. "Art can't be rushed. Dad understands that, which is why he's been so supportive of my work." That evening, as Sarah cleaned up the remnants of Christmas dinner while Marcus entertained their father with readings from his work in progress, she overheard a conversation that crystallized all her growing suspicions about where she truly stood in the family hierarchy. "You don't worry about me, son," their father was saying. "I've made sure everything's taken care of in my will. You'll be able to focus on your art without any financial worries." "Dad, you don't need to talk about that stuff," Marcus replied, "but without the discomfort such a conversation should have prompted, you're going to be around for years yet." "Maybe, maybe not," Robert said pragmatically, "but I want you to know that I've provided for both my children according to their needs. Sarah's always been the practical one. She'll figure out how to make her way. But you, Marcus, you have a gift that needs protecting. I've made sure you'll have the resources to pursue your vision." Sarah felt the dishwater grow cold around her hands as the implications of her father's words sank in. She was the practical one who would figure things out, while Marcus was the gifted artist who needed resources to pursue his vision.
Even in death, their father planned to maintain the same dynamic that had governed their entire lives. 3 months later, Robert Chen died quietly in his sleep after a stroke that the doctors said was mercifully quick. Sarah, who had been sleeping in the next room to monitor his breathing, found him in the morning and called the paramedics, even though she knew it was too late. Marcus arrived at the hospital an hour later, red-eyed and shaking, throwing himself into Sarah's arms with a grief that seemed as genuine as her own. The funeral arrangements fell to Sarah, as most practical matters did, while Marcus dealt with his grief by throwing himself into completing his graphic novel as a tribute to their father's memory. He assured everyone who would listen that Robert had believed deeply in the project and that finishing it was the best way to honor his father's support. 2 weeks after the funeral, Harold Brennan's secretary called to schedule the will reading. Sarah assumed it would be a straightforward affair. Their father had mentioned having a will, and she expected the house and any remaining assets to be divided between herself and Marcus, with perhaps some specific bequests to reflect their different needs and contributions. She was catastrophically wrong. As Attorney Brennan adjusted his reading glasses and began reciting the legal language that would reshape her understanding of her place in her father's life, Sarah felt reality tilting in a way that made the small conference room seem suddenly enormous and airless. "To my son, Marcus Chen," Brennan read in his measured, professional tone, "I leave the entirety of my life insurance policy in the amount of $200,000. My investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $150,000, and my personal property, including my 2019 Honda Civic and all household furnishings." Sarah's pen, which had been taking notes on the legal pad she'd brought, stopped moving. She looked up to see Marcus nodding solemnly, as if this windfall was exactly what he'd expected. "To my daughter Sarah Chen," the lawyer continued, "I leave my house at 2847 Maple Street, Portland, Oregon, and express my gratitude for her dedicated care during my final years." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle.
Sarah's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The house, her father's house, where she'd been living for 3 years, where she'd given up her independent life to care for him, came with a mortgage balance of $127,000 and property taxes that were already 6 months behind. More significantly, it came with $47,000 in medical debt that, as she was about to learn, was now legally her responsibility as the inheritor of the property. Additionally, Brennan continued, consulting another document, there are outstanding medical expenses and final care costs totaling $47,000 that will need to be satisfied by the estate. As the primary beneficiary of real property, Miss Chen, these obligations will transfer to you. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as the mathematics of her inheritance became clear. She was receiving a house worth perhaps $280,000, but burdened with $174,000 in debt and obligations, giving her a net inheritance of roughly $106,000. Marcus was receiving $350,000 in liquid assets with no accompanying debts. The brother who had contributed nothing to their father's care was walking away with more than 3 times the value she was receiving, despite her 3 years of sacrifice. "I don't understand," she managed to say, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "There must be some mistake." Brennan looked sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen, but these were your father's explicit instructions. He was very clear about his intentions when we drafted this will 18 months ago." 18 months ago? Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to remember what had been happening in their family 18 months earlier. That would have been just after Marcus had started his collaboration with Vivian Rhodes, when his excitement about his graphic novel had reached its peak, and their father's pride in his artistic son had seemed to intensify correspondingly. "Did he explain his reasoning?" Sarah asked, aware that she sounded desperate but unable to care about maintaining dignity in the face of such a crushing revelation. The attorney hesitated, glancing between Sarah and Marcus with obvious discomfort. "Your father indicated that he believed you were more financially responsible and better equipped to manage property ownership, while he felt Marcus needed liquid assets to pursue his artistic career." More financially responsible, better equipped to manage property ownership. The euphemisms for "Sarah can handle the burden while Marcus gets the reward" were almost insulting in their transparency. Her father had dressed up his favoritism in language that made it sound like he was giving her the more sophisticated inheritance, when in reality he was saddling her with debt while freeing Marcus to pursue his dreams unencumbered. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carefully modulated to convey appropriate somberness. "Dad always said the house should stay in the family, and you've been living there anyway. It makes sense for you to keep it." The casual way he said it, as if he was graciously allowing her to inherit the burden she'd already been bearing, sent a flash of pure rage through Sarah's system. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, and saw not grief or surprise, but a carefully controlled satisfaction. He had known. Somehow, he had known exactly what was in their father's will. "When did you last speak with Dad about the will?" she asked Marcus directly. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or calculation, crossed his features. "We talked about family stuff occasionally, but nothing specific about inheritance. You know how he was about planning for the future." It was a lie. Sarah could tell it was a lie, not just from Marcus's slightly too casual tone, but from the way he avoided her eyes when he said it. Her brother, who had never shown interest in their father's practical affairs, had somehow known enough about the will's contents to show no surprise at the reading. As they left Brennan's office, Marcus placed a sympathetic hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I know this is a lot to process," he said, "but Dad knew what he was doing. He wanted you to have the stability of property ownership." Stability? As if inheriting $47,000 in medical debt along with a mortgaged house was some kind of financial security rather than a crushing burden that would take her years to resolve. Sarah shrugged off his hand, unable to tolerate his false sympathy when she was beginning to suspect that his surprise at the will's contents had been entirely performative. That night, alone in the house that was now legally hers along with all its attendant debts, Sarah sat at her father's kitchen table and tried to make sense of what had just happened. She spread out the financial documents Brennan had given her, calculating and recalculating the numbers as if mathematical precision could somehow make the situation less devastating. The medical debt wasn't just the expected accumulation of end-of-life care costs. As she reviewed the itemized statements, she discovered charges for treatments and services she'd never authorized, medical equipment that had never been delivered to the house, and consulting fees for specialists her father had never seen. The bills were a maze of healthcare bureaucracy and inflated charges that seemed designed to extract maximum payment from a vulnerable family dealing with terminal illness. More troubling were the credit card statements she found in her father's desk drawer, cards she hadn't known existed that showed months of cash advances and purchases she couldn't identify. The spending pattern was erratic and didn't match her father's dementia-affected behavior. The charges were too regular, too purposeful for someone with cognitive decline. Sarah had been managing her father's finances for the past 18 months, handling his checking account and monitoring his regular expenses. But these credit cards had somehow escaped her notice, hidden away and managed by someone else. Someone who had been systematically draining their father's available credit while Sarah struggled to stretch her own resources to cover his care. As she pieced together the timeline of charges and cash advances, a sickening realization began to form. The credit card activity corresponded almost exactly with the periods when Marcus had been spending more time at their father's house, ostensibly working on his graphic novel in the quiet environment, but actually, Sarah now suspected, manipulating a confused and vulnerable old man into funding his lifestyle.
The $47,000 in debt that she had inherited wasn't just the cost of their father's medical care. It was the cost of Marcus's financial exploitation of their father's declining mental capacity, carefully hidden from Sarah's oversight, and now legally transferred to her as the inheritor of the family home. She spent the rest of the night going through every document in her father's desk, looking for any evidence that might explain how the will had been structured so unfavorably toward her. What she found instead was something that would change everything she thought she knew about her father's final months and the people she had trusted most. Hidden in the back of her father's filing cabinet, behind tax documents and insurance papers that hadn't been touched in years, Sarah discovered a manila envelope marked "Important, Sarah Only" in her father's increasingly shaky handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 6 weeks before his death, along with what appeared to be a different version of his last will and testament. The letter, written in her father's careful script during what must have been a moment of clarity, began with words that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read them. "My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I fear my worst suspicions about Marcus and Vivian have proven true, and they have somehow prevented you from receiving what I truly intended to leave you." Sarah read the letter 3 times before its contents fully registered. Her father, during his lucid moments, had become aware that Marcus and his girlfriend Vivian Rhodes were manipulating his finances and had begun to suspect they might also interfere with his estate planning. The will she had heard read in Brennan's office wasn't the document her father had intended to be his final testament. According to the letter, Robert Chen had prepared 2 versions of his will. The first, drafted 18 months earlier, during a period when his dementia symptoms were worsening, had indeed left the majority of his assets to Marcus. But 6 weeks before his death, during what his doctor had noted as a brief period of improved cognitive function, he had created a revised will that distributed his assets more equitably and reflected his true wishes regarding Sarah's years of sacrifice. The second will, a copy of which was included in the envelope, left the house to Sarah free and clear of medical debts, with those obligations to be paid from the life insurance proceeds. It divided the remaining assets equally between both children, giving Sarah $175,000 in liquid assets to rebuild her life, while Marcus received $175,000 along with their father's personal property. More damning was her father's explanation of why he had hidden this revised will. In his letter, he described discovering that Marcus had been using their father's credit cards without permission, accumulating debt that would burden Sarah if she inherited the house under the original will's terms. He had also learned that Vivian Rhodes, who had been presented as a gallery owner interested in Marcus's art, was actually a legal assistant who had been helping Marcus understand the probate process and identify ways to maximize his inheritance. "I changed my will without telling Marcus or Vivian," her father had written. "I gave the new version to my friend Walter Hoffman for safekeeping and told him to make sure it reached Harold Brennan after my death.
If you're reading this letter instead of celebrating your true inheritance, then something has gone wrong with that plan. Walter Hoffman. Sarah remembered him as one of her father's oldest friends, a retired accountant who had helped Robert manage his finances before his dementia made such assistance necessary. She also remembered that Walter had died unexpectedly of a heart attack just 2 weeks before her father's death, too recent for her to have made the connection between his passing and any potential impact on her father's estate planning. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The will that had been probated wasn't her father's true final testament. Somehow, the revised will that Walter Hoffman was supposed to deliver to the attorney had never reached its destination. Either Walter had failed to fulfill her father's request before his sudden death, or someone had intercepted the document to ensure the original, more favorable to Marcus version remained in effect. Sarah spent the remainder of the night reading and rereading her father's letter, trying to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. Her father had tried to correct the injustice of his earlier will, recognizing that Sarah deserved compensation for her sacrifice and that Marcus's behavior warranted a reduced inheritance. But his attempt at fairness had been thwarted, either by chance or by deliberate interference. As dawn broke over Portland, Sarah realized she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could accept the devastating inheritance she had received, struggle for years to pay off debts that weren't legitimately hers, and allow Marcus to enjoy wealth he had essentially stolen from a confused old man. Or she could fight back, using the evidence her father had left behind to expose the truth and claim what was rightfully hers. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than an inevitability. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years sacrificing her own future to care for her father, watching silently as Marcus manipulated their family's resources for his own benefit. She had inherited debt and responsibility, while he walked away with wealth and freedom. But now she held the evidence that could change everything. Her father's letter concluded with a sentence that would guide her actions in the weeks to come. "You have always been stronger than Marcus, Sarah, and more honest than he will ever be. Trust in that strength, and don't let anyone convince you to accept less than what you deserve." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, along with the copy of her father's true final will. For the first time since leaving Harold Brennan's office, she felt something other than despair. She felt the cold, focused determination that had carried her through 3 years of caregiving and would now carry her through whatever came next. Marcus had played a long game, positioning himself as the beloved, artistic son while systematically exploiting their diminished capacity. Vivian Rhodes had provided expertise and strategy to maximize the theft. Together, they had stolen Sarah's inheritance and left her with debt that was rightfully theirs. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated Sarah Chen, assuming that her years of quiet compliance would accept any outcome without question. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The game was far from over, and Sarah was finally ready to play. The first thing Sarah did the next morning was call in sick to her consulting work and drive to Walter Hoffman's house in the Cedar Hills neighborhood. She had attended his funeral 2 weeks before her father's death, a simple service where his widow Janet had spoken about Walter's meticulous nature and his dedication to helping friends with their financial planning. If anyone would have honored her father's request to deliver the revised will, it would have been Walter. Janet Hoffman answered the door looking older than Sarah remembered, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and her eyes still carrying the weight of recent grief. She brightened when she recognized Sarah, inviting her in for coffee and expressing condolences about Robert's passing. "Your father and Walter were so close," Janet said, as they sat in the tidy living room surrounded by family photos. "Walter talked about him constantly, especially toward the end when your dad's health was declining. He was so worried about both of you children." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, trying to find the right way to broach the subject of her father's will without seeming mercenary so soon after both men's deaths. "Mrs. Hoffman, I'm trying to piece together some of my father's final arrangements, and I wondered if he might have asked Walter to help with any paperwork or documents." Janet's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern. "What kind of documents, dear?" "Legal papers. Maybe something he wanted delivered to his attorney after his death?" Sarah kept her voice casual, but she could see Janet processing the question with unusual care. "You know," Janet said slowly, "there was something. Walter had been agitated the week before he died, kept talking about a promise he'd made to your father. He said Robert had given him something important that needed to be handled properly, but Walter was having trouble reaching someone. Sarah's pulse quickened. Do you remember any details about what he was trying to do? Janet stood up and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. After Walter died, I found some papers in his briefcase that I didn't know what to do with. The funeral arrangements and everything were so overwhelming that I just put them aside. Let me see if I can find them.
She returned with a manila folder that looked similar to the one Sarah had found in her father's filing cabinet. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, handwritten notes in Walter's careful script, and a letter addressed to Harold Brennan that had never been mailed. Walter was supposed to deliver a new will to your father's attorney, Janet explained as Sarah examined the papers. But when he tried to contact Mr. Brennan's office, he kept getting told that Brennan was unavailable and that he should work with someone else in the firm. Walter didn't trust anyone else with something so important, so he kept trying to reach Brennan directly. Sarah's hands were shaking slightly as she read Walter's notes. Her father's friend had been methodical in his attempts to fulfill his promise, documenting each phone call to Brennan's office and the responses he received. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. According to Walter's notes, he had first tried to contact Brennan 3 days after Robert's death. The receptionist told him that Brennan was out of the office but would return his call. When no call came, Walter tried again the next day and was told that Brennan was in meetings all day. On the 3rd day, he was informed that Brennan was handling a complex estate matter and couldn't be disturbed, but that another attorney in the firm could assist him. Walter had refused to work with anyone else, insisting that he needed to speak with Brennan personally about Robert Chen's estate. This had apparently irritated the office staff, who began treating his calls as nuisance interruptions. On his final attempt, just 2 days before his fatal heart attack, Walter had been told that Brennan was aware of the Chen estate matter and that all relevant documents had already been received. Walter was so frustrated, Janet remembered. He kept saying that something wasn't right, that they were giving him the runaround for some reason. He was planning to drive down to their office in person to make sure the will got delivered properly. Sarah felt a chill as she realized what had happened. Walter Hoffman had died before he could personally deliver her father's revised will to Harold Brennan. But someone at Brennan's law firm had been actively preventing Walter from making contact, ensuring that the new will would never reach the attorney who was supposed to probate it. Mrs. Hoffman, Sarah said carefully, who else knew that Walter was supposed to deliver documents to my father's attorney? Janet thought for a moment. Well, your brother Marcus knew about it. He came by the house the day after Walter died, said he'd heard about Walter's passing and wanted to offer his condolences. He seemed very interested in whether Walter had been working on anything important before he died. The room felt suddenly cold despite the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. Marcus had visited Walter's widow the day after Walter's death, ostensibly to offer sympathy, but actually to determine whether Walter had successfully delivered the revised will. When he learned that Walter had died before completing his mission, Marcus must have realized that the original will would remain in effect, giving him the inheritance he had been counting on. Did Marcus ask about any specific documents? Sarah pressed. He asked if Walter had been holding anything for your father, said he was trying to make sure all of Robert's affairs were properly settled. I told him about the papers Walter had been trying to deliver to the lawyer, and Marcus offered to take care of it for me. He said it would save me the trouble of dealing with legal matters while I was grieving. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Did you give him the documents? No, Janet said firmly. Walter had been very specific that the papers should only go to Mr. Brennan personally. I told Marcus I would handle it myself when I was ready. He seems disappointed, but he said he understood. Marcus had tried to intercept the revised will immediately after Walter's death, but Janet's adherence to her husband's instructions had prevented him from obtaining the document. However, his visit had given him crucial information about Walter's attempts to contact Brennan's office, which he had somehow used to ensure the revised will never reached its intended destination. Sarah thanked Janet for the coffee and asked if she could borrow Walter's notes to help piece together her father's final arrangements.
As she drove back toward her father's house, her mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. The obstruction Walter had encountered at Brennan's law firm hadn't been random bureaucratic inefficiency. Someone had been deliberately preventing him from delivering the revised will. That someone had to be connected to Marcus, which meant Marcus had known about the revised will and had taken steps to suppress it. But Marcus didn't have the legal knowledge or professional connections to manipulate a law firm's communications. He had needed help from someone with inside access to the legal system. Vivian Rhodes, the woman Marcus had described as a gallery owner interested in his graphic novel, but whom Sarah's father had identified as a legal assistant with knowledge of probate procedures. Vivian had the professional access and expertise to interfere with Walter's attempts to reach Harold Brennan. Sarah pulled into a coffee shop parking lot and used her phone to search for information about Vivian Rhodes. A few minutes of online investigation revealed that Vivian was indeed employed as a paralegal at Morrison, Keller & Associates, a large Portland law firm that handles estate planning and probate matters. More significantly, Morrison, Keller & Associates had a working relationship with Harold Brennan's smaller firm, often collaborating on complex estate matters. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Vivian Rhodes had used her position in the legal community to monitor Walter Hoffman's attempts to deliver the revised will. She had likely coordinated with someone at Brennan's office to ensure that Walter's calls were deflected and that he never made contact with the attorney handling Robert Chen's estate. When Walter died before completing his mission, the path was clear for the original will to be probated without interference. But Sarah needed more than speculation. She needed evidence that would prove Marcus and Vivian had conspired to suppress her father's true final testament. That evidence, she realized, would have to come from Harold Brennan himself. Sarah called Brennan's office and requested an emergency appointment, explaining that she had discovered new information about her father's estate that required immediate attention. The receptionist was polite but firm in explaining that Brennan was booked solid for the next 2 weeks. When Sarah insisted the matter was urgent and involved potential fraud, she was transferred to Brennan's assistant, who scheduled her for an appointment the following morning. That evening, Sarah spread all the documents she had gathered across her father's dining room table, organizing them chronologically to create a timeline of events. Her father had revised his will 6 weeks before his death, recognizing that Marcus was exploiting his diminished capacity and wanting to ensure Sarah received fair compensation for her years of sacrifice. He had entrusted the revised will to Walter Hoffman, his oldest friend and a man known for his reliability and discretion. Walter had attempted to deliver the revised will to Harold Brennan, but had been systematically obstructed by someone with access to Brennan's office communications. Marcus had visited Walter's widow immediately after Walter's death, attempting to intercept any documents that might threaten his inheritance. When that failed, he had relied on Vivian Rhodes's professional connections to ensure the revised will never reached Brennan. When he learned that Marcus had died before completing his mission, Marcus must have realized that the original will would remain in effect, giving him the inheritance he had been counting on. Did Marcus ask about any specific documents? Sarah pressed. He asked if Walter had been holding anything for your father, said he was trying to make sure all of Robert's affairs were properly settled. I told him about the papers Walter had been trying to deliver to the lawyer, and Marcus offered to take care of it for me. He said it would save me the trouble of dealing with legal matters while I was grieving. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Did you give him the documents? No, Janet said firmly. Walter had been very specific that the papers should only go to Mr. Brennan personally. I told Marcus I would handle it myself when I was ready. He seemed disappointed, but he said he understood. Marcus had tried to intercept the revised will immediately after Walter's death, but Janet's adherence to her husband's instructions had prevented him from obtaining the document. However, his visit had given him crucial information about Walter's attempts to contact Brennan's office, which he had somehow used to ensure the revised will never reach its intended destination. Sarah thanked Janet for the coffee and asked if she could borrow Walter's notes to help piece together her father's final arrangements. As she drove back toward her father's house, her mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. The obstruction Walter had encountered at Brennan's law firm hadn't been random bureaucratic inefficiency. Someone had been deliberately preventing him from delivering the revised will. That someone had to be connected to Marcus, which meant Marcus had known about the revised will and had taken steps to suppress it. But Marcus didn't have the legal knowledge or professional connections to manipulate a law firm's communications. He had needed help from someone with inside access to the legal system. Vivian Rhodes, the woman Marcus had described as a gallery owner interested in his graphic novel, but whom Sarah's father had identified as a legal assistant with knowledge of probate procedures. Vivian had the professional access and expertise to interfere with Walter's attempts to reach Harold Brennan. Sarah pulled into a coffee shop parking lot and used her phone to search for information about Vivian Rhodes. A few minutes of online investigation revealed that Vivian was indeed employed as a paralegal at Morrison, Keller & Associates, a large Portland law firm that handled estate planning and probate matters. More significantly, Morrison, Keller & Associates had a working relationship with Harold Brennan's smaller firm, often collaborating on complex estate matters. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Vivian Rhodes had used her position in the legal community to monitor Walter Hoffman's attempts to deliver the revised will. She had likely coordinated with someone at Brennan's office to ensure that Walter's calls were deflected and that he never made contact with the attorney handling Robert Chen's estate. When Walter died before completing his mission, the path was clear for the original will to be probated without interference. But Sarah needed more than speculation.
The result was that Sarah had inherited $47,000 in debt, while Marcus received $350,000 in assets, a financial outcome that was the opposite of their father's true intentions. But the manipulation went deeper than just the will. The credit card debt that had been transferred to Sarah included charges that Marcus had made using their father's cards, purchases he had hidden from Sarah's oversight while she was managing their father's care. Sarah spent hours going through the credit card statements, matching charges to dates when Marcus had been at their father's house. The pattern was unmistakable. Cash advances had been taken on days when Marcus claimed to be working on his graphic novel in their father's study. Restaurant charges and art supply purchases had been made during periods when Sarah was at work and Marcus was supposedly keeping their father company. The most damning evidence was a series of charges to an art gallery in Southeast Portland, payments that totaled nearly $8,000 over 6 months. Sarah recognized the gallery as the place where Vivian Rhodes worked, not as a gallery owner, but as a part-time employee who helped with sales and customer relations. Marcus had been using their father's credit cards to purchase expensive artwork from Vivian's gallery, transactions that benefited both of them while draining their father's resources. But the artwork was nowhere to be found in their father's house. Sarah had been through every room while organizing his belongings after the funeral, and she had seen no expensive art purchases. Either the artwork had been removed from the house after their father's death, or it had never been delivered there in the first place. Sarah drove to the gallery the next morning before her appointment with Harold Brennan. The small space in the Alberta Arts District was cluttered with local artists' work, ranging from serious pieces to tourist-friendly crafts. She found Vivian Rhodes behind the counter, a striking woman in her early 30s with short auburn hair and the kind of effortless style that suggested both artistic sensibility and professional competence. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, approaching the counter. "I believe you know my brother Marcus." Vivian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around her eyes that suggested recognition and wariness. "Sarah, of course. Marcus has mentioned you. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father sounded like a wonderful man." "Thank you," Sarah replied, studying Vivian's face for any sign of guilt or discomfort. "I'm trying to piece together some of my father's final purchases, and I noticed several charges to this gallery on his credit card statements. Could you help me understand what he bought?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Vivian busied herself with papers behind the counter, clearly buying time to formulate her response. "I'm not sure I remember specific transactions," Vivian said finally. "We have a lot of customers, and I only work here part-time. My main job is in legal services." "Right, Marcus mentioned you're a legal assistant," Sarah said casually. "That must give you insight into estate planning and probate procedures." Vivian's hands stilled on the papers she had been shuffling. "Some, I suppose. It's not really my area of expertise." Sarah pulled out photocopies of the credit card statements, pointing to the charges from Vivian's gallery. "These purchases total almost $8,000 over 6 months. That's a substantial amount for someone on a fixed income with mounting medical expenses.
I'm curious about what kind of artwork my father was collecting. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Vivian stared at the credit card statements. When she finally looked up, her expression had hardened into something more defensive. I think you should discuss this with Marcus, she said. He would know more about your father's purchasing decisions than I would. Marcus told me he was too busy with his graphic novel to pay attention to Dad's day-to-day activities, Sarah replied smoothly. He said he left all the practical matters to me, but somehow I missed these art purchases entirely. Vivian stepped back from the counter, putting physical distance between herself and Sarah. I'm sorry, but I can't help you with this. If you have questions about specific transactions, you'll need to contact our accounting department. The obvious discomfort and evasion confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Vivian Rhodes knew exactly what had happened to the $8,000 in artwork charges, and her refusal to discuss them suggested they were connected to the broader fraud Sarah was uncovering. One more question, Sarah said as she prepared to leave. Do you happen to know Harold Brennan? He's a probate attorney here in Portland. The color drained from Vivian's face so quickly that Sarah was momentarily concerned she might faint. I don't think so, Vivian said, but her voice was strained and unconvincing. That's strange, Sarah continued, because Walter Hoffman's notes indicate that someone at a law firm was preventing him from delivering documents to Brennan's office, someone with inside knowledge of legal procedures and access to professional communications. Vivian turned away, pretending to organize merchandise on a nearby shelf. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that. Sarah left the gallery knowing she had struck a nerve. Vivian Rhodes was clearly involved in the suppression of her father's revised will, and her connection to both Marcus and the legal community made her the perfect accomplice for the fraud that had robbed Sarah of her rightful inheritance. Harold Brennan's office occupied the third floor of a restored brick building in downtown Portland, with tall windows that overlooked the bustling streets below. Brennan himself was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the measured demeanor of someone who had spent decades dealing with family disputes and estate complications. Miss Chen, he said, as she settled into the chair across from his desk, my assistant mentioned that you have concerns about your father's estate. I want to assure you that everything was handled according to his explicit written instructions. Sarah placed Walter Hoffman's notes and her father's letter on Brennan's desk. Mr. Brennan, I have evidence that my father created a revised will 6 weeks before his death, and that this revised will was supposed to be delivered to you by Walter Hoffman. I believe someone prevented that delivery from taking place. Brennan's professional composure didn't waver as he examined the documents, but Sarah could see him processing the implications of what she was showing him. This is quite serious, he said finally. If your father did indeed create a subsequent will, it would supersede the document I probated.